morning. The hearing will come to order. Today's hearing will examine current U.S. policy and U.S. policy options in response to the recent military coup in Malawi and the larger revolt of the Tuareg people in northern Malawi. The Tuaregs have been in conflict with the central government in Bamako, Mali, for many years, but following the service of some Tuaregs as mercenaries for the late Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, the acquisition of more sophisticated weapons from the Libyan conflict, and increasing ties to al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, they now pose a danger not only to Mali, but also to Algeria, Niger, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and perhaps even Nigeria. Meanwhile, Mali in recent years has been a model of African democracy, now finds itself struggling to resurrect democratic governance and put the military back in its proper role as part of the government. The downfall of Mali's democracy could have a negative impact on the future of Mali as well as the entire Sahel region of Africa. Amadou Toumani Touré, popularly known as ATT, led a military coup in 1991 that created a transitional government and democratic elections in 1992. Mali's growing reputation for democratic rule was enhanced in 2002 when President Alpha Omar Kounaré, having served the 2 terms permitted under the Constitution, stepped down, and ATT, running as an independent and leveraging his reputation as Mali's soldier of democracy, was elected president. Unfortunately, 2 issues eroded ATT's initial popularity. The first was a political system in which there appears to have been incentives for corruption. Certainly, there was a growing public perception that the system was corrupt. The second was popular anger toward the government's handling of the Tuareg rebellion in the north. Weeks of protests at the government's response to the northern rebellion dropped ATT's popularity to a new low. On March 21st, mutinying Malawian soldiers, displeased with the management of the Tuareg rebellion, attacked several locations in the capital of Bamako, including the presidential palace, state television, and military barracks. The soldiers said they had formed the National Committee for the Restoration of Democracy and State and declared the following day that they had overthrown the government. This forced ATT into hiding. As a consequence of the instability following the coup, Mali's 3 largest northern cities, Kidal, Gao, and Timbuktu, were overrun by the rebels on 3 consecutive days. On April 5th, after the capture of the town of Douenza, the National Movement for Liberation of Azawad, or the MNLA, said that it had accomplished its goals and called off its offensive. Following day, it proclaimed independence of their homeland, Azawad, from Mali. The Islamic group Ansar al-Din was later part of the rebellion, claiming control of vast swaths of territory, although this control was disputed by the MNLA. On May 26, the MNLA and Ansar al-Din announced that they had signed a pact to join their respective territories and form an Islamic state. Will this alliance last? Perhaps not. The MNLA is an offshoot of a previous nationalist political movement and is dedicated to a separate homeland for the Tuaregs and Moors who comprise its membership. Ansar al-Din, whose name means defenders of faith, is an Islamic group believed to have links with al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and other Islamic groups. Ansar al-Din is dedicated to establishing Sharia law, not only in Azawad, but also in the rest of Mali as well. Disputes between the 2 groups already have resulted in gunfire involving the supposed allies. As we hold this hearing, the Economic Community of West African States, the African Union, and the United Nations are discussing the viability of a peacekeeping mission in Mali. Such a mission would look to secure and protect civilian institutions and help restructure the Mali military. However, it will also form the focus on the situation in the north, which will be a tremendously sensitive matter, especially if the mission of the peacekeeping force is to retake territory from the MNLA and Ansar al-Din. To add further to the problematic nature of the response of the Mali coup and the Tuareg Revolt, there is the matter of providing humanitarian aid to the 210,000 Malian refugees in Niger, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and Algeria. Another 167,000 Malians are internally displaced. Many of them are in remote areas and are difficult to reach with food and medical supplies. There is the question of how effective our aid efforts will be in such a challenging situation. But no matter how difficult this matter is to address, there are too many people affected from the United States to fail to provide leadership in the effort to solve this political and social and humanitarian crisis. To discuss this effort to devise a satisfactory solution to a problematic situation, we do have a very distinguished panel of leaders, and in a moment we'll introduce them. But it's my privilege and honor to yield such time as she may consume to the ranking member, Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I especially want to thank you for working with me today to hold today's hearing on the very serious developments that are unfolding in Mali and the Sahel. While we have held recent hearings on the economic growth and investment opportunities that exist across the continent as a result of AGOA, we turn our focus today to a country and region in the midst of a crisis, and one that requires our focused attention. Thank you as well for your continued leadership, and I look forward to working with you on this and other issues as we touch upon not only the continent's challenges, but the very real opportunities that showcase Africa's rise and continued emergence on the global stage. Prior to the current crisis in Mali, many considered the country a bright star in West Africa. Mali had been holding free and fair elections since '91, and Foreign Affairs extolled the Malian government as a reassuring symbol of Africa's commitment to democracy. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has also made positive remarks on Mali's democracy, saying that Mali had a good record of democratic elections over the last 2 decades. The U.S. government developed a strong and positive relationship with Bamako, and our teams worked diligently on a range of efforts from development to regional security. This, unfortunately, all came to an abrupt and unfortunate halt in the brutal and bloody events in late March. Before the coup, Mali was an important partner in the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership. The partnership was established to strengthen regional government capacity to address the growing threats posed by terrorists and extremist groups, particularly those in the northern part of Mali, including and importantly AQIM. Our bilateral efforts through USAID were significant, focusing on good governance, agricultural development, health, education, and security assistance. The Millennium Challenge Corporation also had significant investments. The MCC Compact was intended to serve as a catalyst for sustainable economic growth and poverty reduction through key infrastructure developments, including the Bamako-Sénou International Airport, a gateway for regional and international trade, and the Niger River for irrigated agriculture. These and other programs have been terminated due to legal restrictions placed on countries that are experiencing or have undergone non-peaceful, non-democratic transitions. And I'll look forward to your testimony to see the impact of that interruption and support. This has resulted, of course, in the immediate halting of approximately $160 million in State Department and USAID-administered aid, a gap that adds negative pressure to an already dire situation. Since the March coup, I followed very closely what is an expanding and complex set of events that has involved numerous players and a constellation of actors and interest. If there is to be sustained peace and stability in Bamako, northern Mali, and the broader region, I believe concerted diplomatic efforts must be brought to bear in response to this evolving crisis. All efforts must be made to get Mali back on track toward a democratically elected government. This must include setting a realistic date for elections. I urge our colleagues at the State Department and our international partners to redouble efforts toward a mediated solution, while working closely to preserve the unity and territorial integrity of Mali. I believe Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Rice have been unequivocal on this point. I also want to express deep concern for the conflict in the north, including what appear to be the advancing interest of AQIM as well as the emboldened Tuareg movement. With the fall of Tripoli, the flight of hundreds of thousands from Libya, and the coup in Bamako, a political and military vacuum has created conditions that have taken a deadly turn. This includes the imposition of harsh Sharia law on local populations, and I hope that our panelists will address that to the extent that that is happening and what is going on. CRS reports that increasingly brazen presence of AQIM commanders in northern Mali, along with unconfirmed reports of fighters from Nigeria and Pakistan, have raised acute regional and Western concerns that Mali could become a launching pad for transnational terrorist attacks. Some of these groups have already appear ready to cut ties with AQIM and some of the more extreme elements. We must work with our international partners towards a solution that sees the disassociation of these ties and the start of negotiations. ECOWAS, the UN, and others are leading efforts toward addressing these very serious concerns extolled by various factions. In closing, let me briefly highlight my serious concern for the humanitarian crisis that is compounding a grim and difficult reality throughout the Sahel. Refugees International, Save the Children, Human Rights Watch reports claim that armed conflict in Mali has compounded an already desperate humanitarian situation in the Sahel, where over 175,000 children are suffering from severe acute malnutrition. To date, the political and humanitarian crisis has led 325,000 people to flee their homes and 180,000 to cross borders to seek safety and basic access to food and water. 59% of these refugees are children. Various agencies have quickly scaled up its operations to address this crisis, but additional resources are critical for an effective and prompt delivery of aid. And we could hopefully also you will address that in terms of the interruption and the potential impact on this. I understand it's not supposed to be interrupted in this area, but maybe you could address that. Displaced persons in northern Mali are particularly at risk, as rebel groups have prevented aid groups from operating in the region. Protection and security concerns are also looming as frequent banditry, kidnappings, and attacks on displaced populations and their host communities threaten to undermine an already fragile coexistence. Humanitarian assistance must be accompanied with long-term solutions that address the varied and complex threats that food insecurity, climate change, and regional instability presents in the Sahel region. Thank you, and I look forward to today's witness panels.
Ms. Bass, thank you very much. I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished panel, beginning first with Johnny Carson. Ambassador Johnny Carson has been a frequent witness before this subcommittee. He currently serves as Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs, a position he has held since May of 2009. Ambassador Carson has a long and distinguished career in public service, including 37 years in the Foreign Service, including time as Ambassador to Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. Ambassador Carson has also served as the staff director of this subcommittee and as a Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania. Ambassador Carson is also the recipient of numerous awards for his service from the State Department. We'll then hear from Earl Gast, who is making his first appearance before our subcommittee since taking over his current post. He is USAID's Assistant Administrator for Africa and has a 21-year career working with USAID and leading development programming, especially in post-conflict and transitioning societies. Prior to his position, Mr. Gast served in Afghanistan, Colombia, Eastern Europe, and Rome. Mr. Gast was also one of the first USAID employees stationed in Iraq. He played an equally important role in developing the post-crisis strategy for Kosovo, monitoring all mission operations. Most prominently, he received the Agency Award for Heroism and Distinguished Unit Award. Thank you for your service, and Ambassador Carson, if you would proceed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very, very much for the kind introduction, and thank you also for holding this very important hearing. I also want to acknowledge the presence of the ranking member on the committee, Congresswoman Bass, and also Congressman Turner. We appreciate your support and assistance and your interest in Africa. Mali today is grappling with 4 overlapping crises that have compromised its stability as well as the security of neighboring countries in the Sahel. Mali is struggling to restore democracy and constitutional rule, to bring an end to the political rebellion of the Tuareg people, to actively combat the radical Islamic threat posed by AQIM and Ansar el-Din, and to respond effectively to an expanding humanitarian crisis in the northern part of the country. A military coup d'etat on March 21 broke Mali's 20-year tradition of democracy. In the aftermath, Tuareg groups that were leading a rebellion in the north of the country since January used the political crisis to effectively partition the country in two. The terrorism threat with which Mali had been struggling prior to the outbreak of the rebellion has grown as al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, known as AQIM, and other extremist groups have taken advantage of the power vacuum that exists in the northern part of Mali. Finally, the fighting and resulting instability has exacerbated the situation of food insecurity in Mali and the Sahel, and more than 370,000 Malians have been displaced. These problems challenge not only the countries in the region, but also run counter to U.S. principles of good governance, civilian control over the military, and respect for human rights. In addition, the vast territory of northern Mali provides a haven for AQIM and other extremist groups that may prove increasingly effective at targeting Western interests. These challenges are interrelated, yet the urgency of the situation demands that we address them simultaneously. Our engagement on Mali is based on two pillars of the administration's African policy: strengthening democratic institutions and advancing peace and security. We also support the principle of regional ownership in the belief that sustainable solutions can only be derived from communication and cooperation with those most directly affected by the problem. On the political crisis, we are maintaining pressure on the coup leaders and the military to respect civilian leadership, to withdraw completely from politics, and to permit the full restoration of a democratically elected government. At the same time, we are supporting the interim government and holding presidential elections before the end of the interim government's mandate in May 2013, as no lasting solution to the problems in northern Mali will be possible without a legitimate interlocutor in Bamako. We believe the Tuareg Rebellion is largely a political problem that requires addressing the legitimate and long-standing grievances of the Tuareg groups in northern Mali. We support regional and international efforts to negotiate a resolution with these groups who have expressed a willingness to enter into dialogue with the Malian government. We reaffirm our commitment to the unity and the territorial integrity of Mali and will provide unequivocal support for a negotiated settlement along those principles. The key to successfully continuing and containing the insecurity emanating from Mali will be to immediately strengthen regional partners such as Mauritania, Niger, and Algeria, and in the longer term to work closely on a common international political approach to legitimize and then to strengthen the political and security forces inside of Mali itself. The humanitarian crisis will require a sustained and coordinated response from the international community. We have provided more than $315 million in humanitarian and food assistance to those displaced by the conflict in the north and those affected by the region's food crisis. We have provided $13.5 million in support to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and other UN agencies to address the needs of Malian refugees. We are urging host countries to maintain their hospitality towards Malian refugees and to maintain the principle of first asylum. While the United States government has made positive strides in working with regional neighbors to resolve this conflict, the ongoing and overlapping conflicts outlined above are far from being resolved. If Mali is going to counter effectively the Tuareg Rebellion, the terrorist threats in the north, and return to a democratic example in the region, it will require sustained and dedicated efforts from the United States government, as well as those in the international community. Specifically, we will need to provide assistance consistent with U.S. law to increase economic and development assistance and provide economic opportunities to disaffected young populations across northern Mali. We will need to continue to build the capacity of Mali's neighbors to control and protect their borders. Finally, we will need to help build resilience in Mali's democratic institutions so that they are better able to represent the Malian people and to withstand the kinds of pressures that they have come under in the recent past. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning. This is a summary of my longer statement, which you and the other committee members have.
And without objection, it will be made a part of the record. I just regrettably have to announce there are 2 votes on the floor right now. We will take a very short recess and then come back and hear Mr. Guest. But Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
The subcommittee will resume its sitting, and Mr. Gast, again, apologize for the delay, but the floor is yours.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and Congressman Turner, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. We are deeply concerned about the ongoing situation in Mali, the immediate threats to human lives and safety, prospects for a peaceful and democratic society, and future opportunities for economic prosperity. I would like to provide an update on the current situation and how it has affected our development program, as well as outline the key factors that are needed for development to progress. Mali is facing a complex emergency that consists of a political crisis, a major drought, and threats to internal and regional security. These interrelated crises call for a careful and comprehensive response. It's important to emphasize that the situation in Mali is fluid and dynamic. Though we are closely monitoring the situation and consulting with other donors and key stakeholders, it is extremely difficult to get a complete picture of the situation in the north. As of early June, 4.6 million persons throughout Mali are facing food insecurity. It is estimated that more than 159,000 persons are displaced within Mali, and an additional 182,000 have fled to neighboring Niger, Mauritania, and Burkina Faso. In the north, violence and division are exacerbating the food crisis, and access to medicine and health services is practically non-existent. Government revenues are 1/4 the level they were just 1 year ago, and accordingly, government provision of basic social services has fallen sharply throughout the country. Though USAID has made significant contributions to Malian development through its long engagement in the country and the hard work and diligence of the Malian people, recent events stand to reverse these gains. Prior to the coup, USAID's broad development portfolio included activities to strengthen democratic institutions, grow the agricultural sector, support literacy and education, improve community health and health systems, and manage instability and threats in the north. And Mali had made significant gains over the past decade. Annual economic growth had averaged more than 5%, and poverty had been reduced from 56% in 2001 to 44% in 2010. In the same time period, child mortality had been cut in half. Mali has liberalized its cereals market, has opened up trade routes, and has improved conditions for doing business. Agricultural production has increased, particularly in areas where USAID has been active. On April 10, 2012, the United States government formally terminated assistance to the government of Mali, consistent with coup restrictions in the Appropriations Act. The activities that were terminated included public school construction as well as capacity building for the government of Mali. However, USAID continues to address the emergency health, nutrition, and food needs of the Malian people. To date, in fiscal year 2012, we have provided more than $50 million to address humanitarian needs within Mali. Other life-saving health and food security programs are under consideration for resumption as part of a case-by-case policy and legal review. In evaluating which programs can move forward in light of the applicable legal restrictions, we consider whether they provide essential life-saving assistance, whether they support children, whether they strengthen food security, or advance U.S. foreign policy. We also consider operational issues, including efficient oversight and management. This case-by-case analysis ensures that there is careful consideration of the context, including how to protect previous U.S. government investments. Before the coup, USAID was the largest donor supporting Mali's planned April 2012 elections, with activities that provided training of poll workers, political party strengthening, elections monitoring, and voter education. When the electoral support activities resume, assistance would help support a foundation for free and fair elections in Mali and a peaceful political exit from the current situation. The only USAID-supported economic growth activities that are continuing in Mali are those that address food security. Agricultural assistance has focused on supporting farmers and herders to increase production in the current planting season. Particularly in light of dire food needs, this assistance is critical to improve access to inputs, increase production, and increase resilience to drought. Some health sector activities have been approved to continue in order to provide life-saving interventions. These programs include preventing maternal and child mortality, identifying and treating malaria, and other critical community-based health interventions. The restoration of democracy with a return to a development focus in Mali is important to the region and to Africa as a whole. Lives and livelihoods are at great risk without the prompt resolution of the current political, security, and food crises. Under the right conditions, Mali has the potential to be a major food producer for the region, as well as advance trade and economic growth. Its history of partnership with the United States to improve health, education, and living conditions is noteworthy. As the situation evolves, we remain vigilant to changes in the operating environment and the risks and opportunities involved. While USAID can provide immediate relief to the people, help set the foundations for democratic elections, and provide basic services in the interim, Mali's future development must be led by the Malian people. This can only be achieved through a duly elected and participatory government, along with peace and stability. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I welcome any questions you might have.
Mr. Gass, thank you so very much for that testimony. And without objection, your full statement and any other materials you'd like to have will be made a part of the record. Ambassador Carson, if I could just ask you with regards to the peacekeeping mission, the estimates are that some 3,000 peacekeepers would be needed. You did speak about it to some extent in your testimony. If you could just elaborate on whether ECOWAS can provide a sufficient number of troops, where will the money come from, how much do we expect that we might bear, or provide, I should say, to that effort. And when it comes to the parameters of the mission, if you could give us some details what U.S. policy and U.S. Hopes and recommendations would be for them, including the rules of engagement for such a peacekeeping mission.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that question. We ourselves are waiting to hear from ECOWAS about precisely what they plan to do and how they plan to do it and how they intend to fund it. We have maintained an open mind about what they are going to do, although we do recognize that there are different scenarios of complexity that could be undertaken. The reality is that ECOWAS should not undertake a mission that is not properly planned, that is not adequately financed, and one that is not adequately thought about over the long term. Generally speaking, I think that it is important for ECOWAS to think first about ensuring the safety and the integrity of those officials in Bamako who are responsible for leading a transition back to a full constitutional and democratically elected government. And I think that would be a much more definable, limited, and supportable operation, rather than looking at the complexities of immediately trying to do anything in the north. One has to take into account that the government in the south has no effective military now. It lost over half of its equipment when it left the northern part of the country, and so any effort to look at retaking the north would be a significant undertaking for ECOWAS. and for the states there. It must be thought out carefully and planned well and resourced appropriately. But I think the focus should be on the South at this point.
Can I just ask you with regards to rules of engagement? I'll never forget on a trip to Darfur, meeting with a Major Ajumbo, who was very upset with the rules of engagement of that deployment. It was early in the deployment. And he had also been deployed to Sarajevo during the Yugoslavian crisis, and said for him it was like deja vu. It was like we're not here to protect, we're here to provide the appearance of protection. I never forgot those words. And given the fact that the UN and even the AU, but especially the UN, has had some major catastrophic UNPROFOR in Yugoslavia, for example, the problems in Rwanda when General Dallaire certainly had sent that famous fax that went unattended to at the United Nations, and of course the killing fields in Rwanda are infamous forever, and it might have been in whole or in part prevented by adequate interventions. So rules of engagement is something that I know you and all of us are very concerned about. What would be your sense as to where this peacekeeping mission would be when it comes to that rules of engagement?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to prejudge what ECOWAS or what the AU will perhaps ask for as they go forward. But I do want to underscore that undertaking a military operation in the north of Mali, an area that is the size of France, would require a major effort.
Well, I'm speaking, Mr. Ambassador, even about protection of other areas where hostilities could ensue. Remember Srebrenica, so-called safe haven, where within the scope of a week, 8,000 Muslims, in that case, were butchered as the Dutch peacekeepers handed off protection of those men to Mladic.
Yeah, no, understood. Again, I'm not going to presume even what the rules of engagement would be in the South, but I do believe that there is probably at this immediate time more of a role to be played in the South than there is in the North, leaving open the prospect at some time that there will, in fact, need to be an engagement in the North to help reconstitute the state and to deal with the terrorist problem that AQIM and Ansar el-Din pose.
I do have about a dozen questions, but we do have votes at 12 in a second panel, so I'll ask only one to Mr. Gast. You talked about the $50 million, and obviously the situation in terms of protecting our own providers of or humanitarian USAID people, actually has to be very high, and the concern. How much are we providing for refugees and for IDPs? And what is the unmet need, perhaps according to UNHCR or any other entity that has come up with a number?
Thank you for the question, and it's difficult to target just the IDPs because what we have is a crisis throughout the Sahel.
And the refugees too.
What we have is a crisis throughout the Sahel, and I know, Congressman, that you're very concerned about the situation, and there are 19 million people who are in need of food aid throughout the Sahel. Now, so before the coup had taken place and before the security conditions had worsened and before we had the refugees, the estimate of those who were food insecure in Mali was about 3 million. And now that figure has nearly doubled. About 5.5 million persons are food insecure. Obviously, the IDPs who've remained in country, and roughly 140,000 are food insecure, and part of that larger number. So part of our $50 million response, it's not just for the 180,000 or 140,000 who are displaced internally, it's for the larger population. PRM is supporting refugees, roughly 160 to 180,000 in Niger and Burkina Faso, and the amount of money that they have programmed to date is roughly 10 million.
Thank you. Ms. Bass?
Thank you. Once again, I want to thank our two representatives here for your testimony today. And as I mentioned to you, Mr. Gass, it was great to see you over here, and I appreciate you hosting us when we were in Uganda. It was just a short time period, but it was very eye-opening. Appreciate that, and also appreciate the time the ambassador took the other day in giving me an overall briefing of the Africa section. I wanted to ask you a few questions about the Tuareg. Ambassador, you mentioned that they are primarily a political problem, and I wanted to know if you could describe a little bit more in detail about what you mean. What is the political problem, and then what might a solution be?
Thank you very much. The Tuareg are only one of many groups that occupy northern Mali, but they are a nomadic group that has felt politically marginalized by a government which has been largely dominated by Southerners. They have felt that their economic and social and political needs have not been catered to. Not enough positions in government and in the civil service.
Were they restricted from running for office or anything?
No, they're not. But because they're nomadic, issues of education were a part of this. But there's also been a feeling that not enough development assistance has flowed into the Tuareg regions. Not enough money put into education, not enough money put into health care, not enough money put into roads and to infrastructure, and not enough money put into economic development. This is a political problem that has existed not just since Mali's independence over the last 10 years. It's a problem that has existed going back to the era of French colonialism. The Tuaregs felt disadvantaged even under the French, and they have felt disadvantaged since independence. They have frequently rebelled, and in 2006, 2007, the government in Mali and the Tuareg came to an agreement called the Algiers Accord, negotiated by the Algerians to address some of the many social, economic, and political marginalization issues of the Tuareg. The Tuareg felt that this agreement was not honored, and it led to a resumption of combat and fighting. But the reality is that this is a political issue, a feeling of marginalization, lack of inclusion, and a lack of economic and social services in the northern part of the country.
So if it wasn't dealt with appropriately when Mali was doing well, what would you envision, the future being? How would or can it be resolved?
Absolutely, very good question. I think there need to be more guarantees from the international community to support those development projects which the government in Bamako agrees to undertake with respect to the Tuareg. If, in fact, there is a political agreement that says that there are going to be X number of schools, hospitals, and kilometers of road built, X number of wells, I think that the international community needs to come forward to serve as one of the guarantors, one of the financiers of the projects that are undertaken. On the political side, I think there needs to be more transparency to ensure that more Tuareg citizens, more citizens of the North who have Tuareg ethnicity are included in the civil service and are included in government positions. But on the economic side, I think there is a way to ensure that money is allocated and is appropriately used for the North. And I do make a very sharp and clear distinction The Tuareg issue is a political issue.
Right.
The issue of AQIM and Ansar is a terrorist issue. They need to be handled separately, and we should not, in the effort to respond to the Tuareg issue, drive them into the hands of Ansar el-Din or into the hands of the Islamists.
Well, and it leads me to another question, because I believe you, or it might have been Mr. Gass, mentioned that one of the things that needs to be done is we need to build resilience in the institutions, but yet at the same time, we're restricted, right? I mean, the aid that you talked about we're limited to, I know, is the humanitarian aid, and we're not allowed to contribute resources to the very thing that you said. So my additional question is, do you think it is too restrictive? Is there something that we need to do legislatively to provide more flexibility?
So we are allowed to work on, authorized to work on food security, and that's a big concern. The problem that we have is one of access. Because it is so dangerous in the north, because fighting continues, it's very difficult for us to have access. Now,
but I wasn't referring to the humanitarian part, because I understood that that was okay. It was the part about us building institutions, the schools, you know, whatever, that we're not allowed to now, right?
So we're not building schools.
Right.
We're not supporting government operations, which would include education at this point. We are working in the health sector because that is providing life-saving support. We are working, in addition to humanitarian assistance, food security, and working with private farmers and associations to try and strengthen food security.
Congresswoman Bass, may I just add
Sure.
to that to say that we do have the capacity to use funding to help the government move back towards democracy. And if there is a roadmap and a timetable for the return to democracy, including for support to elections, we have the latitude to work in that democratic space. And certainly after there is a return to a civilian and democratic government, then we would be able to do more beyond just support of elections, and then look at ways to put money into strengthening the other democratic institutions, the independence of the judiciary, the capacity of the legislature, strengthening civil society and media. But we do have the capacity, even today, if there is an appropriate roadmap presented that is creditable and that we believe will lead towards elections, we do have the flexibility to jump back in to that small democratic space to begin the process.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask you about ECOWAS, and I wanted to know your opinion. If the U.S. should push for the formation of an international group on Mali that would allow actors from ECOWAS, from CENSAD, the EU, Organization of Islamic Conference, to all come together and engage on this. Do you think that that would be useful? What role should the U.S. play if it is?
Congresswoman Bass, again, thank you for the question. We believe that an international contact group of Friends of Mali, if one wants to use that term, or some kind of a grouping that helps to bring together key stakeholders and participants in the process of helping Mali return to democracy. We believe that ECOWAS needs to continue to play the primary role as the leading regional, sub-regional organization, but ECOWAS does not, in fact, include several other very important partners who have long borders with Mali, who have and share ethnic groups with Mali who are not a part of this. Two of the most important, of course, are Algeria and Mauritania. We also need to ensure that other international players who can play a supporting role can be a part of the discussions, and in that I include the United States, I include France, I include particularly the European Union. Those organizations and countries that can be instrumental in helping to facilitate and guarantee things like I mentioned before with respect to being able to help fund perhaps programs in the northern part of the country to deal with the grievances of the Tuareg. So there needs to be a place where all of these groups can, in fact, come to the table and talk. I think this is something that the ECOWAS leadership and the AU, the African Union leadership, are working on and thinking about. And of course, the other major player in all of this has to be the United Nations. So what you are talking about does make sense, and it's something that we are constantly encouraging, so that all important players and partners are at the table, with ECOWAS continuing to be a lead in all of this.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Turner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question for Ambassador Carson. We've had ethnic, economic, political factors here for many years. The one wild card seems to me religious. Could you fill us in a bit on the background and what are the factors at work here, and is this being addressed, or should it be?
Many of the problems of radicalism in northern Mali are a spillover from other countries. The AQIM, which is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, is comprised not simply of Malians, but its leadership is largely drawn from individuals who have come from Algiers, from Mauritania, and from Libya, and from other countries in the region. We know that a number of AQIM leaders and supporters have come down from Algeria, and as Algeria has effectively dealt with its Islamic extremist and terrorist problem, many of those people have drifted down across the Algerian border into northern Mali, which is very, very large territory and very, very sparsely populated, not traversed by many roads and not inhabited by many towns. And so those individuals have come into this large space. Malians as a whole, and especially including the Tuareg, are moderate Muslims, not extremists, but individuals who have been open and tolerant towards Christians and others. So AQIM, again, is very, very different, and its agenda and politics are quite different from those of the Tuareg as a whole.
Right. Is their ideology gaining any traction in other ethnic groups besides those that are coming down from the north?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that both AQIM and Ansar al-Din are really relatively small groups. That doesn't mean that they're benign. They are, in fact, dangerous and lethal. but they are not representative of the vast, overwhelming majority of Malians in the north, and they certainly don't represent the majority view of the way Islam should be practiced in Mali.
Thank you. I yield back.
Very much. We're joined by Ms. Jackson Lee, not a member of the committee, and we welcome her. If you have a question or two.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I recognize your courtesies of both you and Ms. Bass. I appreciate being a former member of the committee and appreciating the work. Let me say to the two witnesses, I was delayed with business on the floor of the House, but I'm delighted of your presence here, and I wanted to first, Ambassador Carson, wrap some questions together that then will relate to Mali and the present status. My initial question is to assess basically the health of Africa as relates to U.S.-African relationships. And are we doing what we're supposed to do? And I'll follow up now with the present situation in Mali, and I'd certainly appreciate that the Administrator Gass would also ask. As I recall, and I may not be correct, that the Malian population is somewhat nomadic, moving around. And so I'm asking, in this 2012 atmosphere, whether or not this new uprising conflict has created population displacement, whether or not we are seeing a severe impact, a more severe impact on women and children. And then lastly, it's a difficult role for the United States to play. If you read the basis of the rebellion, it is to suggest that the government in place was despotic and unfair. How conflicting is our position of supporting the existing sovereign government to the issues of the values that we promote, which are those of democracy? And I'd appreciate, I think there were three wrapped in there, and I appreciate your questions and your answers. Thank you.
Congresswoman Jackson Lee, thank you very much for the questions. I will attempt to take a couple of those on and then allow my colleague to address those which concern humanitarian and refugee issues, but we'll also weigh in if required. Your first question was about the health of U.S.-Africa relations. I think that U.S.-Africa relations are strong and vibrant, that the United States remains well respected and admired across the continent, with the exception of a couple of rogue states and rogue leaders. Consistent polling that we do through large established polling organizations, as well as the polls that we do through the U.S. embassies and U.S. government, show that the U.S. is favorably liked by higher levels than almost any other nation in the world. And in Africa, our polling is consistently more favorable than it is in any other part of the world: Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, or South Asia. And those that polling data is quite significant. We can share it with you, but the relationship is healthy.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
The relationship is healthy. I think that there is a great appreciation for what we do in the area of development assistance. Our overall development assistance to Africa amounts to somewhere in the neighborhood of $8.5 to $9 billion. This includes what we do in development assistance, humanitarian assistance, and food aid through the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And we continue to be the single largest provider of development assistance across the continent, and ours is open and transparent. Equally, we have been very strongly engaged in advancing an agenda which has just been redefined by the President and the National Security Staff to do everything that we can to continue to promote democracy and good governance across the continent. And I would say that despite the difficulties of a Mali, I would say that democracy is on the advance across Africa. One can look back over the last 3 years and identify not just one or two or half a dozen, but dozens of indications where this is in fact the case. Successful elections in Nigeria, the largest country in Africa. The peaceful transition of and handover of power in places like Senegal, where President Wade stood aside after losing, and where President Banda stood aside to allow President Sata to come in. The movement away from military regimes into democracy. Niger, where we saw 2 years ago the return to democracy after a sitting president attempted to hijack the Constitution and then was overthrown by a military government and then returned to power, a civilian government. We also saw within the last 2 years, for the first time in its history, democratic elections in Guinea-Conakry, which had been under military and authoritarian rule since its independence from France in the 1960s and 1960. Across the continent, we see a commitment to democracy, and we almost take for granted elections in places like Botswana, places like Ghana, places like Namibia, places like Mozambique and Mauritius, all of which have democratic foundations and which are making great progress. So the democracy agenda is moving forward. Yes, no question, hiccups out there, they're a problem. But a part of the second pillar of the administration's commitment is to do everything that we can do to spur economic growth, trade, and investment in Africa, recognizing that it is going to be the creation of economic opportunities driven by private sector investment that is going to create the jobs and create the factories that are going to grow economies. And we are committed in this area as well. And I would argue that there is, in fact, a lot happening there. One can look at the McKinsey study report, one can look at reports from Oxford Analytica, the World Bank, and shows the strong growth of Africa as a market and potential market. Everyone's heard, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. The return on private investment in the African marketplace is higher than it is in any other part of the world. And I could go on and on about what is in fact happening there. What we need to do is to sustain it and to push it forward. And we're also engaged in 2 other things, in 2 other areas, and that is to do as much as we can to promote peace and stability across the continent. And we are engaged in Sudan. We are engaged in Somalia, just as we are engaged with the ECOWAS leadership on Mali. And then finally, the preserve of my colleague here, and that is to help to promote opportunity and to support the initiatives that the administration has underway in promoting greater food security, the green agricultural revolution that Africa needs, and also to support global health. I think the relationship is healthy. I think that despite what we see as the drumbeat of the occasional headline of a distressing situation in one African country, we need to reorient our thinking to not focus on the one or two or three problems that we see in the 55 different states across Africa, but to focus on the promise and potential that we see in Africa, and recognize that this Africa is a continent with 55 different states. And quite honestly, some of those states have never been in turmoil, and some of those states have always been democratic, and some of those states are doing quite well.
Congresswoman, Mali over the last 10 years has had significant growth, 5% on average year-on-year growth. And that has helped to lift a sizable portion of the population out of poverty, which is significant. Unfortunately, a majority of the population has benefited from that, but a minority has not, and the minority that has not is in the north. As Ambassador Carson mentioned, the size of the north is approximately the size of France, and the population of the north before the displacements was roughly 1.5 million persons. So access is extremely difficult. Opportunities for employment, very few. Opportunities for growth, given the harsh terrain of the Sahara Desert, also very, very, very few. And that has helped exacerbate the crisis in the north. Now, the problem is that this crisis also threatens to undermine the progress that has been made in the south with agriculture, with growth, the displacements, the inability of the government to continue financing services that it would normally finance. The economy is going to contract. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the government revenues are down considerably from last year. So at a time when it's not being financed by external actors, cannot finance its own needs. So we're very concerned about that. You raised the issue of women and children, and unfortunately, women and children do suffer far greater than the men in times of crisis. And Mali has made significant gains over the last 10 years. It has been able to cut child mortality rates and maternal mortality rates by half, but still it ranks at the bottom of, near the bottom. Only Somalia has higher maternal and child mortality rates. So we're concerned about that. It is very, very difficult in this environment for us to have access in the north. There are only a few actors, NGOs, international NGOs that are operating in the north, and each has to negotiate access with each community and rebel group operating in the north.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your testimony. And we do have
Thank you.
several members of the committee, a number of questions we'll submit for the record. And again, I thank you. I'd like to now invite our second panel to the witness table, beginning with Ni Akwete. Mr. Akwete is an independent policy researcher and analyst who specializes in U.S. foreign policy, African development, and international relations. He often publishes in American and African journals and appears on Al Jazeera, Voice of America, the BBC, and other TV and radio outlets analyzing African issues. He has done a stint as a Georgetown professor, a journal editor, and leader of advocacy organizations working on 3 continents. He created and led 2 organizations focusing on democracy and the conflict in Mali. We'll then hear from Mr. Rudolph Atalia, who is a 21-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force who retired as a lieutenant colonel. He served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as Africa Counterterrorism Director, where his responsibilities, including advising the Secretary of Defense and other senior officials on counterterrorism policy and strategy, and serving as an advisor to the State Department and numerous embassies across Africa. He has been featured guest on programs on NPR, C-SPAN, and National Geographic Channel, where he discussed African counter-piracy and successful resolution of the 2000 Mazurk, Alabama incident. We'll then hear from Mr. Dave Peterson, who is the Senior Director of the Africa Program for the National Endowment for Democracy since 1988. He has been responsible for NED's program to identify and assist hundreds of African non-governmental organizations and activists working for democracy, human rights, free press, justice, and peace. He was the former executive director of the Project South Africa and of the A. Philip Randolph Educational Fund, and a freelance journalist in Africa as well as in Turkey. He has visited more than 40 African countries since '84 and has published numerous articles on African politics. Mr. Akbate, if you could begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Bass, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, I very much appreciate this opportunity to appear before you and share my opinion, but I'm particularly grateful that you have taken the time to consider an issue in Africa that I think is extremely important and has a lot of dangerous potential and requires attention and assistance. My full statement, I would like to request to be part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered, as well as all of your full statements.
So I just want to summarize the main points. My recommendation, looking at the Mali situation, is that the U.S. should respond with two initiatives. One is that I believe the situation is very urgent and dangerous, and the regional body, ECOWAS, has stepped up. As I look at the situation and also watch the news, I'm reminded of the fires going on in Colorado. And the image that jumps to my mind is that the Pentagon, it seems to me, will rush to the aid of the firefighters because the Air Force training academy is threatened. I do believe that this is an analogy for what is going on in Mali. A lot of Malians are affected, a lot of West Africans are affected, but I also think that important American interests can be harmed if the situation deteriorates. And therefore, it seems to me it is both ethical and very good for the United States to help ECOWAS deal with the situation. My second recommendation, and I listened carefully to the presentation by the preceding panel, the federal officials. It seems to me that the elephant in the room is the potential for terrorism in Africa and U.S. response and U.S. policy since 9/11 and the creation of AFRICOM. Now, I think AFRICOM had a strong presence and programs with the democratic government of Mali. And therefore, I think the U.S. government should take this as an opportunity to review the policies followed since 9/11 to see areas that require improvement so that Africa policy and U.S.-Africa relations can be stronger. Good policy review, in my view, will require a comprehensive exercise. But I do think there are things that one can see even now. And among those is that democracy should play a much bigger role in U.S. policy, even when it comes to dealing with issues of terrorism. The 55 African countries are extremely complex, so of course you always have grievances. But it seems to me that democracy is the way to go, rather than strengthening African militaries. So I think U.S. policy should emphasize democracy and de-emphasize particularly military assistance except in emergency situations. And of course, the thing to be avoided is that no U.S. troops are required anywhere on the continent except in very rare cases. Also, I think that training that the U.S. gives African soldiers, militaries, need to start with training that asks them to respect the democratic institutions of their countries. I do think that too many African militaries take for themselves the right to determine who should govern their countries or not. The continent has been moving away from that, and it would be good if U.S. military assistance and training pushes soldiers to understand that they must respect the democratic choices of their populations, that it is not their job to select who runs their countries. And I think that the U.S. AFRICOM has, there is a question of where its headquarters are to be located. I think that it will be a good idea if the headquarters are brought to the United States, because there is worry in many African countries as to whether there will be large bases and military headquarters. And therefore, I think to deal with those worries, it would be good if, like other U.S. commands, they are based in the United States. I think that will go a long way to ease worries about the U.S. military presence, because the relationship between the two areas, the U.S. and Africa, will thrive on a civilian basis. Mr. Chairman, I want to end here, and I will look forward to expanding on any of my points in the question period. I thank you very much again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Waite. I'd like to ask Mr. Atala if you would proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to come before you today and speak about this important topic. And thank you for adding my analysis and summary into the records. While I come today in a personal capacity, the analysis and views, which are my own, were shaped by my 21 years of military service. Between 2001 and 2003, I spent extensive time with the Tuaregs in the north, specifically in Gao, Kidal, and Teslit. As a native Arabic speaker, I got the chance to sit down and speak with many of the senior Tuareg leaders and local imams. So my ideas are shaped by that time. Also, more recently, with my private company, White Mountain Research, I've spent extensive time in the region, keeping track of the current situation. To fully understand what's going on, I'd like to just dive into a brief history. The 17 January Tuareg uprising is the fourth since Mali's independence in 1960, and a continuation of basically a half a century of ongoing differences between the Tuaregs and the government of Mali. The differences are between a Tuareg whose identity is in their Tamashek language and Bamako in the south. To understand how we arrived at the current crisis in Mali, it's important to briefly mention the Third Tuareg Rebellion, which was launched in 2006 by a defiant Tuareg leader named Ibrahim Agbahanga. The rebellion lasted for 3 years while Algeria attempted to broker peace between the government and the rebels. In 2009, Mali dispatched troops to the north to stop Bahanga, and he was exiled to Libya. He returned in January 2011. During his time in Libya, Bahanga made contact with Tuareg officers and tribesmen from Gaddafi's military. When Gaddafi's regime began to fall, Bahanga convinced his tribesmen to abandon their military posts and go after Gaddafi's weapons. Tuareg defectors raided the large stockpiles of Gaddafi's arms and ammunitions, loaded trucks, and jumped in convoys and headed south. Bahanga's ambitions to fuel another uprising in northern Mali took root among well-trained and well-equipped Tuareg force. Bahanga was killed in a mysterious car accident in the summer of 2011, and in October of that same year, in the oasis town of Zakak near the border of Algeria, on the Malian side, Tuareg youth, intellectuals, Malian army deserters, Libyan-trained Tuareg soldiers formed the Mouvement National pour la Libération d'Azawad, or MNLA as we like to call it today, Azawad being the land or the northern part of Mali. During this meeting, another Tuareg named Iyad Aghali, who was leader in the first rebellion in the 1990s, and also joined Bahanga in the third rebellion in 2006, tried to join the MNLA, but they rejected him. And they rejected him for many reasons. One, he plays both sides of the fence, and he's done that before. He's one of AQIM, has deep relationships with them, and he's got very radical beliefs. So he went on to form his own organization or Salafist Islamist group called Ansar ad-Din, or Defenders of the Faith. MNLA's primary objective for liberating Azawad, as they like to call it, was the creation of a secular democratic state that represents all ethnic groups in northern Mali, not just the Tuaregs. It was fighting basically for culture, pride, and self-determination. Despite its swift victory, MNLA's agenda was quickly undermined by the threat of militant Islamic dominance. At the helm of the threat was the Ansar ad-Din Aghali. And so with Ansar ad-Din putting a Tuareg face on AQIM, if that didn't exist, there would be more resistance to the Salafist presence and broader support for MNLA. In recent weeks, Tuaregs tolerant of Ansar ad-Din began to learn more the truth about the organization. Reports conveyed on 26 June from Tuareg families living in Timbuktu said that local boys as young as 11 and 12 years old are being deceived and lured into Salafist training camps over promises to receive food and money in return for doing odd jobs. One father went to one of these camps to bring his son back and was told by the leader of Ansar ad-Din running the camp that he can have his boy back after he had fulfilled his duties to Allah. The harsh reality is people without money rely on handouts from Ansar ad-Din, which has full support of AQIM, is well-funded and well-equipped. In return, families have to send their sons to newly militarized madrasas where they're taught to fire AK-47s and are indoctrinated into harsh interpretation of Islam. 2 days ago, fighters from an AQIM splinter group clashed with MNLA in the city of Gao. Reports indicate that 20 people were killed. And a day after the clash, leaders of the various Islamist groups got together, took over Gao, and had discussions that are still unknown. The information's accurate. We're getting down to a showdown now between the MNLA and the Islamists, which is actually unfolding as we speak. Although the international community would never entertain the idea of an Azawadian independence, efforts need to be made to support MNLA and Tuaregs who oppose the extremist groups from operating in the Sahel. Tuaregs are masters of their environment. They can play a key role in stabilizing the region by driving out these groups. And they have the will to do so, but they can't do it on their own. Unfortunately, the present situation is getting bleak. Mali's becoming a magnet for foreign fighters who are flocking in to train recruits to use sophisticated weapons pilfered and taken from Gaddafi's arsenal. So what's the end game for the extremist groups? AQ leadership wants to take advantage of the shifting political landscape in North Africa. To accomplish this goal, it has to rely on its regional affiliate AQIM. However, the setbacks AQIM has suffered over the last few years are significant. Its ability to recruit is basically down to zero. To survive and remain effective, AQIM needs money and soldiers. The Sahel has become an ideal ground for both, and the Tuareg function as collateral. Until now, Mali's military has been ineffective to drive out AQIM from the northern part of the country. The international community and Mali's neighbors should not support the current Bamako regime to conduct military intervention on its own. This will be counterproductive and could lead more local support to Ansar ad-Din and AQIM. The best approach to counter the crisis is to create a buffer zone around the areas where the Salafists operate. The buffer zone should restrict movement by air and ground of illegal goods entering and leaving the area. On a larger scale, a systematic regional approach aimed at targeting illegal drug trafficking, tobacco, and weapons should be addressed to curb terrorist access to money and diminish their cash flow to recruit and buy more weapons. Further, an effective information campaign is indispensable to discredit AQIM and Ansar ad-Din and reinforce local distrust of their motives. However, direct intervention by Western states will reinforce the extremists' raison d'être and will exacerbate the crisis. The solution must be brokered by regional actors and guided by regional experts. There also must be support for border control and counterterrorism programs for the Sahelian states, where intelligence collection and info sharing requires significant improvement. Furthermore, these states do not have the ability to respond to security threats in remote areas distant from their capitals. This is the reason why Mali has been ineffective at maintaining control of the north. Although AQIM's Southern Zone Battalion is no more than 300 strong, the vast operational area makes it very difficult to target these individuals absent of regional state collaboration. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Atala, for your very extensive recommendations and the wisdom I think you bring to this committee, given especially your contacts in the North. Thank you so much for that. I'd like to now ask Mr. Peterson, if you would proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee. It's a great privilege to testify before you this morning regarding the recent crisis in Mali. In the 5 minutes I've been given this morning, I'd like to make two essential points. The first emphasizes the political importance of Mali. The second describes the endowment's efforts to contribute to the restoration of democracy. I congratulate the committee for demonstrating its concern about Mali by holding this hearing. Although I'm not able to speak to the strategic threat of al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and the Tuareg rebels to American interests, I would like to emphasize the grave setback the military coup and division of Mali has made to the democratic movement in West Africa, and indeed for the entire continent. Mali was among the very first African countries to lead the second wave of independence in 1991, when a popular uprising and the military's refusal to fire on protesters led to the downfall of the longtime dictator Moussa Traoré, followed by a sovereign national conference and free and fair elections in 1992. Although one of the poorest countries in the world, Mali remained at the forefront of democratic reforms in the region, pioneering a vibrant independent broadcast media and civil society, adopting democratic innovations such as the public democratic questioning space for government officials, implementing one of the first decentralization reforms in Africa, and leading ECOWAS and the AU in promoting democratic government throughout the continent. In 2007, aided by modest NED support, Mali hosted the World Conference of the Community of Democracies. Mali seemed to disprove the contention that only rich countries can be free, and its relative stability for 2 decades served as a touchstone for the slow but steady democratic progress we've seen throughout West Africa. This is not to say that Malian democracy was perfect. Participation in elections has rarely been above 30%. Corruption has grown steadily as a problem, undermining faith in democratic government. Terrorist activity and discontent among the Tuareg have repeatedly plagued Mali. Yet, those of us working to support democratic development in Africa were caught off guard by the sudden reversal of democracy's fortunes in Mali. The coup was a huge blow to democracy, although the resolute opposition of ECOWAS and the international community has been encouraging. Unfortunately, the coup leaders seem to be controlling the agenda, and the capacity of ECOWAS to intervene in a forceful way seems limited. Even worse is the secession of the North. Not only has the sovereignty of Mali been abandoned, but the new rulers don't even pretend to respect democracy. According to Sanda Ould Boumama, Ansar Din's spokesman in Timbuktu, I quote, "Sharia has to be applied whether the people like it or not. We will enforce it. We are not asking anybody's opinion. We are not Democrats. We are servants of Allah who demands Sharia." In recent years, NED has supported programs by the International Republican Institute to strengthen Mali's decentralization and by the National Democratic Institute to support the Malian legislature. U.S. aid funding has also been provided to NDI to assist the electoral process, but due to the coup, that's currently suspended. Nevertheless, based on our assessment that Mali was a reasonably stable and functioning democracy prior to the coup, until recently, that country has not been a high priority, given the vast needs across the region. Obviously, this is no longer the case. And with the blessing of the NED's board of directors, it will be necessary to shift funding from programs budgeted for other parts of West Africa to address the new situation in Mali. Mr. Chairman, the endowment does not design projects here in Washington and attempt to implement them on the ground. Rather, we provide funding for proposals that are not formally solicited, that we receive from indigenous NGOs. We've already received proposals, and I expect staff to travel to Mali in the coming months to assess the situation and meet with potential partners. Indeed, the outlines of our strategy for Mali are already beginning to take shape. First, we will support the restoration of democratic legitimacy in the South. And second, we will seek ways to help Malians engage with the North to promote reconciliation and ultimately reunification and democracy. At this stage, it is difficult to estimate our budget for Mali, but I would hope it would amount to at least several $100,000 by next year. The transitional government in Mali has agreed to hold elections within a year, and my colleagues at NDI, who had been working on the elections before the coup, suggest that it would be better for these elections to happen within the next 6 months, rather than at the end of that time frame. Past elections have been troubled by boycotts, fraud, and poor management, and NED will seek to support domestic election observation efforts and other transparency initiatives. Disaffection with politicians and corruption has contributed to low voter turnout, and NED will also support projects that provide voter education, advocate accountability, and promote popular participation. Malians were shocked and confused by the sudden disappearance of their democracy, and NED will seek to support efforts to rebuild their understanding and commitment to democratic values. Public opinion polling and focus groups that can probe what happened to Malian citizens' commitment to democracy could serve as a basis for designing such civic education programs. Mali has had a vibrant women's movement. NED will particularly target programs mobilizing women as voters and political leaders. Mali has had nearly 200 radio stations, 8 daily newspapers, and 40 periodicals, but recent attacks against the press are troubling. NED will seek to address this problem. Human rights abuses have also reportedly escalated, and NED will consider support to Mali's well-established human rights movement for human rights monitoring, education, and advocacy. Finally, given the apparent problems with the Malian military, notwithstanding the assistance it has received from the U.S. military, NED will consider innovative proposals from civil society organizations assisting with security sector reform. In the northern part of the country, as has been noted, the new rulers have little regard for democracy. Yet the Tuareg, who've led the rebellion, represent an ethnic minority in the north. And even among the Tuareg, the separatist agenda has a questionable level of support, and the radical Islamic agenda of Ansar Dine and AQIM even less. Few of the rebels seem to have experience with governance and are more comfortable with their nomadic traditions than the settled culture of towns and villages. Although the presence of civil society and independent media is thinner in the north than in the south, NED will seek to support those organizations and radio stations that do exist in the north on a range of initiatives. Our experience in Somalia, for example, has found considerable traction supporting radio broadcasts promoting democratic values. Projects strengthening the capacity of traditional leaders and other community authorities vis-a-vis extremists have also had some success. Hundreds of thousands of Malians are fleeing the north due to drought, locusts, and the repression and bizarre edicts of the rebels. Projects helping these internally displaced persons can protect their rights in the vulnerable conditions in which they now find themselves, enable them to participate in democratic processes such as elections, as well as lay the foundations for their eventual return home.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, the Malian crisis may be more effectively resolved through the battle for hearts and minds than through military confrontation. NED is not so presumptuous as to pretend that our modest resources alone can fix what ails the country. We trust that other international donors will also become more involved. The crisis in Mali is unlikely to be resolved easily. It may take many years. But as I hope I have convinced you this morning, much can be done to address the many challenges faced by its people. There's already much in recent Malian history and institutions that can provide the basis for democratic renewal. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to answer.
Peterson, thank you very much for your testimony, and thank you for the work, the great work that NED does throughout Africa and around the world. Let me just ask you, we have about 14 minutes left, and then there's an hour and 20 minutes worth of votes. So I thought we would propose questions, and as best you can, answer rapid fire from the three of us. Very quickly to Mr. Atala, you mentioned that Tuaregs see flirtation with militant Islam as temporary. When does this friendship, this alliance break apart? Does it become armed? You heard earlier questions that I had asked about the ECOWAS peacekeeping. Is 3,000 enough? How quickly do they need to be deployed to be efficacious in mitigating all this horrible bloodshed and danger? Rules of engagement, if you want to touch on that one as well. The issue of the Tuaregs who have felt disenfranchised and discriminated for so long, have we blown it? Has the West, the United States, and others not taken their concerns adequately into consideration? Or were we doing much on that? And finally, I have lots of questions, but we are running slow out of time. Ms. Bass, if you could offer your questions.
Sure. My questions center on AFRICOM and really are directed to the first two speakers because I kind of heard maybe something different, and I'm not really sure, because you were referring to difficulties within AFRICOM. You mentioned that AFRICOM maybe should be centered here as opposed to Stuttgart. You talked about, the role of the U.S. in terms of beefing up militaries, and maybe that isn't the best way to go. Then on the other hand, you described the serious security concerns. And so I'm just wondering, kind of from both of you, if you could address AFRICOM, where you feel it could be better. What could it do differently?
And Mr. Turner?
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Bass, thank you for your questions. I'll try to address them as quickly as possible. Just from my experience, first of all, let me start off with the ECOWAS question. I completely agree with Ambassador Carson. We need to take care of the South first before we look at the. I mean, the North is obviously an incredibly important question, but the South needs to get its act together in order to effectively, answer the problems in the North. Speaking specifically on the Tuaregs, they are a secular people. I've spent enough time with them to know. As an example, back in 2002, there were militant Islamists coming in from Pakistan that were trying to recruit from within the ranks of the Tuaregs, primarily focused on the youth. The Tuaregs leaders that were with me told me this will never happen in our culture. We're a tolerant people. We accept everybody. If they're going to take the backbone of our people, our youth, then we're going to fight them. The case still stands today, although you have an anomaly right now, a guy named Aghali, who's on the Salafist side of the House. He's the only one projecting an extremist face within the Tuaregs. Not a lot of Tuaregs support that. As a matter of fact, recent days are showing the major rift between them. So have we blown it? I think we could do a lot more for them. Typical grievances that Ambassador Carson covered are spot on. One thing that, if you talk to Tuaregs in the North, they say the fact that paved roads end in Mopti, in the center part of the country, is just embodies how we're left alone and nobody really cares. They rely on tourism. They rely on, that's part of their culture. And so now it's all been hijacked by the extremists, and it's also, they've never had anything. They don't have, good health care, no infrastructure, all the things that Ambassador Carson addressed. So in terms of how do we address the North and what can AFRICOM do, I think we need to step up more the regional involvements, better intel sharing. It's been very weak, very, very weak. States don't trust states. Algeria doesn't trust its neighbors, and vice versa. That we have to crack the code on that, because actionable intelligence to go after these individuals is key. And they want to hijack, AQIM and AQ and BIG wants to take advantage of what's going on politically in the political landscape in North Africa. I don't want to eat up all the time, but one more point is if you look at the letters that came out of the bin Laden compounds, 17 of them are already translated by CTC in West Point. Bin Laden was very focused in working with AQIM is to hijack the Arab Spring and start making missionaries. Their sole goal essentially is to regroup, reinforce, make enough money, bring enough recruits, and come back after the United States and its allies. Something we have to pay attention to. AFRICOM can play a big role. We need to tighten that noose around where the radicals are working and take away primarily their cash flow, which comes through drugs, extortions, kidnappings, and whatnot. And so effectively, not only intelligence, but having all state actors work together. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. To begin with AFRICOM, it is true that the problems in Mali just deteriorated very fast since January. But some of us who have been admiring and looking at Mali were concerned that before this time, for the past few years, a lot of U.S. relations and activities with the Amadou Tuareg government was largely military assistance and military exercises. Nobody is prescient, but if you look at that government's record, and as has been said, the problem with the Tuaregs has been there for a long time. There were eruptions even before independence. So some of us thought that U.S. relations with Mali should have emphasized democracy, should have emphasized ways to deal with the Tuareg problem. I would call that democracy, reconciliation, and development. Now, I am not unmindful of the terrorism problems in Africa. I think terrorists have caused havoc in Africa, from the embassy bombings, Boko Haram, and others. But the idea is that given the complexity of African countries, perhaps emphasizing democracy and development and reconciliation would quiet down problems in the area, and then you isolate extremists who have to be dealt with. So frankly, some of us were concerned that for the past few years, the Amadou Tuareg government was incentivized to ignore some of the internal problems and focus on military engagement against the Akim and the other groups in the north. That has been the concern.
Mr. Wekte, in your testimony, you suggested that the U.S. military training is not providing respect for democratic institutions. Could you provide the committee the information on that, and does that also apply to human rights training and anti-human trafficking training? Is U.S. military trainers sufficiently inculcating that attitude that human rights matter, respect for democratic institutions? I'd love to get the evidence of that, if you could provide that for us.
I would be glad to provide what I can come up with. My concern has been that African soldiers, number one, if I had anything to do with who gets trained, we will prioritize soldiers in democracies rather than soldiers who are serving unelected strongmen, because that causes a problem. That is my first concern. And then, of course, what exactly are they being trained about? They should be trained to respect the democratically elected leaders. If I might make a quick comment on how quickly the problem in Bamako versus the problem in the north. I did hear and listen carefully to what Ambassador Carson said and what Mr. Atala has said, but part of my worry is the security concern that if too much, by the time the problem in the south, if we take too much time, the problem in the north would have become much bigger. And I do think, therefore, that ECOWAS needs the support to get up to speed to make sure that things don't deteriorate as quickly in the north as before the south gets its act together.
Okay, we do have, again, I said to our outstanding panel, a number of written questions we'd like to convey to you, and if you could get back to us as quickly as possible. And thank you for your extraordinary leadership and insights. It provides this committee a very, very useful way forward. Thank you so very much. I'm sorry that we do have to break. There's an hour and 20 minutes worth of votes on the floor. The hearing is adjourned.